All right, today we're going to look at more versions of our prototype. And when you're looking at these versions, notice that, if I'm not mistaken, there has been no change at all to the HTML of the code. The only changes that have been made have been to the CSS. And that's a really important topic, because what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to change the design of the site, change the basic layout of the site and the appearance of the site without touching the HTML, without changing the content. And a good website that demonstrates how that can be done is this website, CSS Zen Garden. If you notice, this talks about CSS design, and might notice a couple of sections of the page so that we can compare them later on. CSS Zen Garden, the beauty of CSS design, the road to enlightenment. So what is this about? If we click on any of these examples of other layouts, that was the one that we were on. We click on one of the other layouts, CSS Zen Garden. So what is this all about? The road to enlightenment. This is the same HTML, but with different CSS applied. All these examples have the exact same HTML, yet the appearance is radically different because they've applied different CSS to the HTML. And that's a powerful thing, which means that if your company wants to undergo rebranding, for example, they change their logo, they change other things about the company, you don't have to go and rewrite the entire website. You can just change the CSS and you're in business. So we've done this to a milder degree. Keep in mind, this is the work of professional web designers that do this, as their job. So their sites look outstanding. Our changes that we're going to make are maybe a little less radical, but again, they demonstrate the same point. So we left off last time and we developed two examples. We developed this example where the size was fixed. It was 600 pixels, if I remember right, and centered. And we did this example where we based it on a percentage instead of a fixed width. I think we went over this one as well. Not 600, maybe 800 or something. Look in here, CSS doesn't have fixed numbers. It has a width of 75. It also has a minimum width of 550 pixels. That means no matter how small the screen gets, notice at this point, it won't get any smaller than the 575 pixels. So a lot of times when you use a width as a percentage, you also use a minimum width to keep it from becoming extremely narrow. Other than that, this layout is about the same as the first one. So for width, remember the CSS box that we talked about. With width, you can either put in a number of pixels or you can put in a percentage. And you can also put a minimum width if you use a percentage. Let's look at prototype 3. This is a little different, because if you notice, all of our sections of the page are pinned down to certain positions. And if we resize or whatever, it doesn't matter. They stay pinned down to those different areas. Remember, the HTML is the same. We still have the same header, nav, section, and footer. Let's look at the CSS in this example now. All right, we have our background colors and text colors, our font family. We have a background image, but only on the header section. So we only have that background image on the header section. So you don't have to do a background image on the entire page. You can do it over different sections of the page. The main difference between this is we have given this an absolute position. What does an absolute position mean? It means it takes these numbers, how far from the top, how far from the left, and it pins down this section at that spot. So this header right here is 10 pixels from the top, 10 pixels from the left. And it's absolute, means it's going to stay there no matter what else we do. Now we do that with the navigation. We give it a width of 200. We put it 150 from the top, 10 from the left. Again, position absolute. So 150 from the top, 10 from the left. So that lines up. We've done that with each of these sections. We've given them a top and a left setting. You can do top, left, bottom, and right. Usually you use top and left because people read in our culture from the top and from the left, going across and then down. The footer, I think, was off a little bit. The top is 1700. I'm going to change that to 1800 because I noticed there was a little overlapping. There, that's better. Now, the advantage of this kind of layout is we can get it to look exactly the way we want it to. The disadvantage is that it's going to look the same regardless of what device we view this on. So if we view it on a web browser, it might look like this, on a desktop computer, that is. If we go to a mobile device, which you could go to More, Tools, Desktop Tools, click on this thing little here. Even on a smaller phone, it's going to look like that. Generally, as a rule, you want single column. A lot of times, single columns are preferred on a mobile device. So this looks the same no matter what. And that may be a disadvantage as you move from device to device. This is known as fixed position because everything is pinned down using absolute position, top, and left. Go through these examples, these other examples pretty quick. Let's see if there's anything else notable in this one. Not really. Oh, there is something notable in this example. The Iceland page in this example. Notice that we have style.css and Iceland.css. We don't have to have a separate CSS file for every page, but we can if we need to. For example, the Iceland page, if you notice, I really don't see any difference of it looking at it. Let's look at what's in here. Oh, background URL of the header is Iceland.jpg. What is it on the regular one? Oh, bg.jpg. Okay, there we go. The home page looks like this and has that as a background for the header. On the Iceland page, we have a different background image for the header. Notice as we look at this, though, that all we have in the Iceland CSS file is what we want different on the Iceland page. So the only thing we want to change from the basic CSS is we want to change the background image of the header. And then what do we do? We put both style sheets in the Iceland file. So this gives us most of the style. This one overrides that one little detail, the background image of the header. The position matters. If I were to switch these around, it's not going to get the desired effect. All right. If you have multiple style sheets, it's literally the second one that wins. Or I should say the last one that wins. If you have two different style rules that apply to the same thing on the page, whichever one is the last one takes precedence over the first one. Sometimes in class, I'll have people ask me like, well, what if we don't want all our pages to look exactly the same? What do I do? Well, you do something like this. You'd have your main style sheet that has most of your style rules in it, and then you'd create a second style sheet that it applies just to one page or maybe one set of pages. Our goal is to make our pages look consistent. But that doesn't mean they need to look identical. So very often you will have a style sheet that has most of the style rules in it and a second style sheet that has things that are unique to one page or one set of pages. And that's exactly what we have in this example here. Some of these things. The next example that we're going to look at, prototype 4, uses what is called relative positioning. Notice it also is a fixed position. Notice we have a scroll bar on this text. Let's look at what we do in this style sheet. All right, same background image, same font families. The header, we have a width of 900 pixels, a padding of 15, and so on. Notice we don't have any position for this. We have not specified top or left or anything like that. Therefore, the browser is going to place it in what's called the flow. If we didn't have any style sheet whatsoever, I delete the entire style sheet and save it. These things get positioned one after the other. That positioning of one after the other is called the flow. And if we don't specify the location of something, it simply falls in line with the flow. So that is why this header is positioned where it is. It just falls in line with the flow. Likewise with navigation. There's no position in navigation. So that simply appears underneath the header, just like we had before. Now the section is where things get a little different. We're using not absolute position, but relative position. And that means that it's going to be positioned relative to where it naturally wants to appear. Let's get rid of all the style code again. Notice where this is. It's about this position on the screen. Without any CSS, though, it wants to appear here. We want to push it to the left and up. So this is its natural position in the flow. We want to push it to the left and up. And we do that via relative position. So we say this, we want to go up 350 pixels. So we do a top of negative 350 pixels. And, oh, no, that's the wrong one. A top of negative 380 pixels and a left of 250 pixels. So that says, hey, take this where it wants to appear and push it to the left 250 pixels and up 380 pixels. And that's exactly what this does. Pushes it to the left and up. So it's over at that spot on the page. We do the same thing with the footer. Remember the footer? Naturally, it wants to appear way down here. So we want to push it up 350 pixels. That's what top 350 pixels. You can see where the position is going to be if we get rid of this relative. So if I get rid of this relative position, you'll notice that the footer is down here. Well, we want to lift it up by a certain number of pixels. The other thing we did with this is we put in overflow. Overflow auto means that it will automatically add scroll bars. It could possibly add vertical or horizontal scroll bars. In this case, it's adding a vertical scroll bar. All right, on to the next design. Type number 5. This one is kind of neat because the navigation over here stays in place as we scroll the rest of the page. That can be a very nice feature for your user because no matter where you go on the page, the navigation is always there and available for them. Notice in these other examples, if you scroll, the navigation could go off the page. Whereas this method, if we scroll, the navigation stays on the page. That is done with the position fixed. Position fixed means that even if you scroll, the position doesn't change. We go back a couple examples. It's a little different than position absolute. This one we had position absolute. All right. What does that mean? It means that the position is based on this spot of the page. And as that spot scrolls off the page, this is going to follow it. So this is position absolute. This is position fixed, where it stays in place no matter what. Now, the other ones we simply give a margin to. In this case, we give a margin left of 300 pixels to the section, to the header, and to the footer, so that these things stay out of the way of the navigation. So we say margin 300 pixels. And so everything is pushed over 300 pixels from the left. The last one, not completely there, but it's the start of what's called floating. Floating works like this. You can put things side by side, and they'll stay side by side as long as there's enough space for them. If there's not enough space for them, boom, they flip down and they're on top of each other like this. Now, I'd have to do a little bit more to make this work completely, but this is often a kind of layout that's used on mobile sites or on sites that are optimized for mobile, because you can see here at the wide display width, it's 2 columns, and it's easily seen on a desktop device. On a mobile device, though, it's better to have a 1-column web pages, and we get that once we get narrower than a certain amount. It's not working the way I expected it to. We can tell that though by narrowing it like this. Let me show you what this means in more detail, how this floating works before we look at this example. This is a simple example where I have two text areas, two areas of text. And if the screen is wide, they appear side by side. If the screen is small, they appear on top of it. Smaller, they appear on top of each other. I'm going to change this real quick to left because that makes a little more sense. Screen is so wide, they're side by side. The screen gets narrower. They go vertical. You can see here the sections. The HTML is very simple. We just have a couple sections. Each section has a couple of paragraphs. And then finally, we have a footer on the bottom. The CSS looks like this. For each section, we have a width of 45%. And then we say float left. Now I could make this an absolute number if I wanted to. So I could say width, make 600 pixels, float left. Here's what that means. If the browser is wide enough to hold two things with 600 pixels, it'll put them side by side. So this screen is probably something like 2,000 pixels wide or 1,800 or something like that. So we can fit two 600 pixel items side by side. At a certain point though, if we get too small, boom, it drops down. That's accomplished with the float. That's what the float tells it. The float tells it if you can put this side by side with everything else that is floated, then do so. Otherwise, drop it down and start it on a new line down below. So a float will either put it side by side or down below. Now, if I say with 100% float left, well, it's never going to be able to put that 100% next to anything else, right? Because 100% is already the screen width. So I can't put that 100% side by side over here. So therefore, if I say float left, it's never going to be able to do that. It's never going to be able to float it alongside of it. If I made this down to like 10% maybe, then it could put them side by side. Then it drops them below when there's not enough space. But at 100%, that guarantees that this is going to be on a line all by itself. Now, as we saw in before, I can also do this with percentages. Instead of 600 pixels, I can say 60%. And if it can fit it side by side, it will. Well, that makes sense, it can't, because 60% plus 60% is over 100%. So of course it's going to put them on top of each other. What I meant to say is 40%. Now 40%, it can put them side by side, and it'll do so until it can't. Now, why doesn't it always size them so that they're next to each other? Remember that the padding and the margin and the border get added onto it. So in this case, we have a padding, we have a 1 pixel border, a 10 pixel padding, a 20 pixel margin. So those all get added into the 40% plus these extra pixels. And that's why they don't always stay side by side. If I made this 50%, in fact, you might think that they'd be side by side, but they're not, because 50% is actually 50% plus these other things. That makes it more than 50%. A little bit more. Now, one thing I can do also is I can put a minimum length, minimum width in here. So I can say, I want this to be 40 pixels, 40% rather, but I don't want to get it any small. I don't want to get it real small like this. Maybe I put a minimum width of 400 pixels. All right. So it'll resize, it will resize, it will resize until it can't get any smaller, and then boom, it will place it side by side. And it'll never get smaller than 400 pixels. Now, this is getting in the direction of being a nice design on a mobile device. Maybe. What I'm doing wrong here. I am getting it to work when I resize it this way, though. Because in this case, this is how it would look on a desktop device with a wide browser window. This is how it would look on a mobile device with not so wide of a browser window. Which is exactly kind of the thing that we want. We kind of want to have one column designs on mobile devices. If you go to many websites and view them not on your computer but on a mobile device, many of them will be just a single column, because that's kind of like the preferred design for this. Now, if we look at this prototype, The header is 95% and float to the left. Well, 95% plus these other margins and borders and padding, that's going to go across the entire screen. So it goes across the entire screen. No matter how small we make it, it's never going to allow, or how big we make it, it's never going to allow enough space to put this alongside of it. Navigation, we specify as being a width of 25%, but a minimum width of 200 pixels. So if this browser window is really wide, navigation gets a little bit wider. But as this navigation gets small, as this window gets smaller, there's going to be a size that navigation gets stuck at, and it won't get any smaller than that. The section, we make a width of 50%. We have not specified a minimum width for that, so it will always be 50%, no matter how narrow it gets. However, if it can't fit that 50% alongside of this 200 pixels, in fact, we can even predict about the size of this. This is 200 pixels. At what point will 50% be less than 200 pixels? Right around the 400 pixel width, this browser will display this underneath each other, because this has to take up 200 pixels plus padding and margin and all that. This wants to put it up at about 200 and some pixels, and it can't fit that alongside of this, which is 200 pixels plus. So therefore, it drops down to be its own, to be on its own line. One nice thing with this, and I did this with a number of these examples, is notice how these kind of have the effect of looking like buttons. So let's examine how I did that in this example. First of all, list style type of none means that there's no bullet points on our unordered list. LI, I give a margin bottom of 20 pixels rather. That puts 20 pixels between each of these LIs. Remember, we haven't looked at the HTML in a while for these because all the HTML has been the same. But remember, our navigation, like it normally will be, is simply going to be an unordered list. We specify the display as being inline block. Inline block is sort of a cross between inline and block. If there's enough space, it would stack them side by side, but there isn't. All right. But then I can put attributes on it like it's a block tag. So I can give it a width of 150 pixels. Font size is 1.2 M. What does that mean? That means slightly bigger than normal. Compare the font here with the font here is 1.2 times the default size. Very small border, very small curving, roundedness of the border. Might be hard to see on the projector, but these corners are just ever so slightly rounded. I can make those bigger to make it more rounded. There, it should be visible. Padding 3 pixels. Without that padding, the H in home would be right up alongside the border, which we don't want. We want there to be a little space in there. Text decoration none, meaning that by default, links are underlined. We're saying we don't want that underlined for this link. And finally, the color, we give a pale yellow color for the text, and the background we give almost a shade of gray. This is slightly off gray because it says 333533. That's not exactly gray. Now on hover, in other words, when the user's mouse is over that link, we get this style rule, which switches the background and the color. So the background will be this pale yellow, and the color of the text will be this almost gray. We're moving in the direction of what's called responsive web design. We haven't covered that topic completely yet, but we've built some of the building blocks. We've come up with some of the building blocks. The idea of responsive web design is so that a page will look good no matter where it's being displayed, how big the browser window is, or if it's being displayed on a mobile device or whatever. So let me Google responsive page example. Okay. Notice here's how this looks on a desktop web browser with fairly wide window. Notice as I make these bigger or smaller, these panels get bigger and smaller. At a certain point, though, we go from 4 to 3. In other words, the web page is responding to what I'm doing. That's what I mean by responsive design. And if the web page gets small enough, everything sort of collapses into one column. Each of those panels then only takes up one. So let's case study. Okay, let's notice we have case study, and then we have the one with the black background. As we get to a certain size, they take up the full width of the screen. So if we're going to view this on a phone, so it would look on an iPhone SE. So it would look on a Pixel 5. So on. You see, the page is responding to the size of the browser window. That's real important today because, again, studies have shown that the use of mobile devices to access website continues to grow. So back in, several years back, you would assume that most people viewing your website were viewing it on a computer. You can't make that assumption now. Therefore, you have to design for your site to look good across as many different platforms as possible. And that's the whole notion of responsive design. Next week, we're going to cover two additional prototypes, two additional ways of doing it. We're going to use grids and what's called a flex box. So there's some readings this week on it. You can get a head start. My suggestion to you is go and play with these things. Download the examples and take a look at them, study them, and see if you have any questions about it. Next week, we're going to be talking about responsive design, where we're going to try to make websites that look good both on a mobile device and on a desktop device. Are there any questions now? All right, that's all I had for you today. We will see you next week.